What if everything you've been taught about success is backward, while others chase comfort? The truly exceptional embrace destruction. The greatest minds throughout history discovered this unforgiving law. Greatness isn't achieved by building yourself up, it's unleashed by tearing yourself down. This is no coincidence. Friedrich Nietzsche, that merciless diagnostician of the human condition, recognized a brutal truth. We remain mediocre precisely because we refuse to be destroyed. I say unto you, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. Your potential greatness lies buried under the comfortable identity you refuse to sacrifice. What if your deepest failure isn't that you haven't achieved enough, but that you've sacrificed too little? What if your carefully preserved self, with all its reasonable limits and modest ambitions, is exactly what stands between you and greatness? The philosophy of Nietzsche confronts us with this uncomfortable possibility. His vision of the Übermensch, or overman, isn't about adding new skills or virtues to your existing self. It demands something far more radical, a complete sacrifice of what you are for what you might become. Like the caterpillar that must dissolve inside the chrysalis before emerging as a butterfly, true transformation requires a kind of death. But this raises disturbing questions. What exactly must be sacrificed in this pursuit? Is anything preserved in this transmutation? And most troublingly, is the price too high? The answers reveal the profound paradox within Nietzsche's philosophy, that total sacrifice somehow leads to ultimate fulfillment. This isn't the comfortable sacrifice of giving up dessert to lose weight. This is the existential sacrifice of everything you identify with, your beliefs, your morality, your very sense of self. Let us venture into this philosophical wilderness, where the demands of greatness collide with the reality of human limitation, and where the path to becoming more than human begins with the willingness to surrender what makes us merely human. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. This thunderous proclamation from Nietzsche's The Gay Science wasn't merely a theological statement, but an existential one. It announced the collapse of the transcendent framework that had ordered Western civilization for millennia. But what happens when the ultimate source of meaning vanishes? For Nietzsche, this vacuum represented both crisis and opportunity. The death of God left humanity with a choice: sink into nihilism or create new values through an act of supreme will. But here emerges our first sacrifice. We must surrender the comfort of received wisdom, the security of absolute moral frameworks, and the reassurance that the universe cares about our existence. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end, Nietzsche writes. But what bridges are we willing to burn behind us as we journey toward new horizons of meaning? Consider the magnitude of this sacrifice. The religious person finds purpose in divine will, the traditionalist finds meaning in ancestral wisdom, even the scientific materialist finds comfort in objective facts. But the Nietzschean hero must abandon these ready-made frameworks and stand alone in the void, confronting the terrifying freedom of creating values from nothing. Is it any wonder that most people shy away from this burden? As Dostoevsky observed through his character Ivan Karamazov, without God everything is permitted, not as a liberation, but as a terrifying responsibility. Most would rather have comforting illusions than the burden of creating meaning. But for Nietzsche, there is no victory without this initial sacrifice of comfort and certainty. The first step toward the Übermensch requires the courage to face a meaningless universe and nevertheless declare, "I will create meaning through my will." This act of creation amid the void becomes the foundation upon which all other transformations must build, setting the stage for the more personal sacrifices that follow. The dancing star metaphor from Zarathustra reveals a profound insight. Creation requires destruction. In Nietzschean terms, becoming the Übermensch demands the sacrifice of your current self. What does this mean in practice? It means that the qualities you currently identify with, your personality, your habits, your cherished beliefs, must be recognized as contingent, as merely human, all too human. They must be subjected to ruthless examination, and when found wanting, discarded. This is what Nietzsche means when he speaks of self-overcoming, Selbstüberwindung, the continual process of surpassing yourself, of treating your current identity as something to be overcome. The self that pursues greatness must continually sacrifice itself to make room for something greater. As he writes, "What is the greatest thing you can experience? It is the hour of great contempt, the hour in which even your happiness grows loathsome to you, and so also your reason and virtue." This raises a troubling question. If we must sacrifice our current identity to become something greater, what remains of us in this transformation? Is there continuity of self in Nietzsche's vision, or only a series of deaths and rebirths? Consider the metamorphoses Zarathustra describes. Of 3 metamorphoses of the spirit I tell you, how the spirit becomes a camel, and the camel a lion, and the lion at last a child. The camel bears burdens willingly, the lion destroys old values, and the child creates new ones. Each stage requires the death of the previous identity. The sacrifice of self is perhaps the most difficult to accept because it threatens our most basic psychological need, continuity of identity. We instinctively resist the suggestion that we must become fundamentally different to achieve greatness. Yet for Nietzsche, this resistance is precisely what we must overcome. The attachment to our current self, with all its mediocrity and compromise, is the greatest obstacle to transformation. Only by embracing this inner death can we prepare the ground for a more profound ethical rebirth, where even our most fundamental moral assumptions must be reconsidered. What is done out of love always takes place beyond good and evil. With this provocative statement from Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche signals his most radical demand, the sacrifice of conventional morality in service of a higher ethic. For Nietzsche, traditional morality, particularly Christian or slave morality, represents a system of values designed to protect the weak and constrain the strong. It elevates values like humility, pity, and equality, virtues that Nietzsche viewed with suspicion. But what happens when we sacrifice these moral constraints? What replaces them? This is where many readers misinterpret Nietzsche, seeing in his critique of morality a license for cruelty or selfishness. Critics like Bertrand Russell have accused Nietzsche of promoting a dangerous elitism that could justify oppression. In A History of Western Philosophy, Russell writes that Nietzsche's philosophy amounts to a power fantasy that can be attractive only to the very timid. The misappropriation of his ideas by fascist ideologues in the 20th century lends weight to this criticism. The troubling legacy of Nietzsche's thought cannot be ignored. His rhetoric of higher and lower types of humans, his contempt for democratic values, and his glorification of strength have been used to justify terrible atrocities. Walter Kaufmann, one of Nietzsche's most sympathetic interpreters, acknowledges that Nietzsche's ideas of rank and his pathos of distance have something that is, at best, disquieting. However, defenders argue that Nietzsche's target wasn't morality itself, but moralities that prevent human flourishing and greatness. When Nietzsche advocates going beyond good and evil, he isn't suggesting amorality, but rather a more nuanced ethical stance, what he called the revaluation of all values. The Übermensch doesn't abandon ethics, he creates new values based on life affirmation rather than life denial. Consider this challenge: what moral principles do you hold, simply because they were handed down to you? Which of your ethical commitments have you never truly questioned? What would happen if you suspended these judgments and asked, does this moral belief enhance life or diminish it? The moral sacrifice Nietzsche demands is therefore dialectical. We must be willing to question everything while simultaneously creating values that affirm life in its complexity. It requires a maturity rare among humans, the ability to live without external moral authority while exercising rigorous internal discipline. This moral autonomy necessarily separates one from the herd, creating an isolation that constitutes yet another profound sacrifice on the path to greatness. The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. This observation from "Thus Spoke Zarathustra" reveals a painful truth. The pursuit of greatness leads to isolation. The Nietzschean hero must sacrifice not only internal certainties but external comforts, particularly the comfort of belonging. Consider the symbolic significance of Zarathustra's mountain. He descends from solitude to share his wisdom, only to find himself misunderstood and rejected. This pattern reflects Nietzsche's understanding that the person who questions fundamental values inevitably separates themselves from the community that upholds those values. The sacrifice of community manifests in multiple ways. First, there is the intellectual isolation that comes from questioning what others take for granted. Then there is the emotional isolation of pursuing goals that others cannot comprehend. Finally, there is the practical isolation of walking paths that few have traveled. As Nietzsche writes, the secret for harvesting from existence the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously. But dangerous living rarely attracts companions. Few are willing to abandon the security of the herd for the precarious freedom of the heights. This raises a profound question: is greatness worth the sacrifice of human connection? Can one truly flourish in isolation? Even Nietzsche, that champion of solitude, suffered terribly from his isolation. Yet Nietzsche insists that new forms of community are possible among those who have made similar sacrifices. He imagines free spirits recognizing each other across vast distances, forming bonds based not on shared illusions but on shared courage. For believe me, the secret for harvesting from existence the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously. Build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius. Send your ships into uncharted seas. Perhaps in this dangerous living new forms of authentic connection emerge, connections forged in the crucible of shared transformation rather than shared comfort. Through this lens, isolation becomes not an end but a necessary passage toward a more authentic form of community, one founded on the willingness to sacrifice comfort itself for something greater, joy. My formula for greatness in a human being is Amor Fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, but love it. With these words from a case homo, Nietzsche articulates perhaps his most counterintuitive demand: we must sacrifice the pursuit of mere happiness for something greater, the affirmation of life in its totality, including its suffering. Amor Fati, love of fate, represents Nietzsche's radical vision of saying yes to life exactly as it is, with all its pain and disappointment. It's not merely accepting fate, but embracing it with passion. Conventional wisdom equates the good life with the absence of pain, with comfort and security, but Nietzsche viewed this pursuit of contentment as a profound mistake, a shrinking from life rather than an embrace of it. He distinguished between happiness, a temporary pleasant state, and joy, the ecstatic affirmation of existence including its pain. But why would anyone choose suffering over comfort? Because Nietzsche argues, true growth and transformation are impossible without it. What doesn't kill me, makes me stronger, isn't merely a catchy aphorism, but a psychological insight about how humans develop resilience and depth. This raises difficult questions. Have you ever truly grown during periods of comfort and ease? Or has your development always required challenges that pushed you beyond your limits? What capacities within yourself would remain forever dormant without the stimulus of suffering? The sacrifice of contentment doesn't mean seeking suffering for its own sake. Nietzsche was no masochist. Rather, it means accepting suffering as an inevitable component of any life fully lived, any ambition fully pursued. It means saying yes to life without conditions, without the childish demand that it conform to our desires for pleasure and ease. As Albert Camus noted in direct conversation with Nietzsche's ideas, there is no sun without shadow, and it is essential to know the night. The Nietzschean hero doesn't eliminate suffering, he transforms it into a catalyst for growth, an opportunity for self-overcoming. This transformation of suffering into meaning represents the final element necessary to understand the central paradox of Nietzsche's philosophy, that complete sacrifice somehow leads to ultimate fulfillment. Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? This challenge from Thus Spoke Zarathustra brings us to the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy. The Übermensch represents both complete sacrifice and ultimate fulfillment. This paradox works on three levels. First, becoming more than human means sacrificing what is merely human. Second, creating new values requires destroying old ones. Third, achieving true victory means surrendering the very ego that desires victory. This last point is often missed. The will to power, mistakenly seen as domination over others, is primarily about mastery over oneself. As Nietzsche writes, he who cannot obey himself will be commanded. The greatest power comes through self-overcoming, which means sacrificing the very self that seeks power. Think of the artist who must lose herself in creating her greatest work, or the athlete in a flow state who performs best when conscious control disappears. In both cases, the ego must step aside for greatness to emerge. The Übermensch Paradox reveals a fundamental truth. Complete victory requires complete sacrifice because victory itself is transformed through sacrifice. Victory becomes not the ego's triumph over obstacles, but the emergence of something beyond ego that can fully embrace life. This philosophical insight, so counterintuitive to our conventional understanding of success, deserves closer examination in terms of how it might actually be lived in practice. Become who you are. This deceptively simple command from Nietzsche's The Gay Science holds the key to applying his philosophy. But how do we navigate the sacrifices required to become our authentic selves? First, recognize that Nietzschean sacrifice isn't mindless self-denial. Unlike religious asceticism, Nietzsche advocates strategic sacrifice, abandoning what limits us to embrace what expands us. Consider the difference. The ascetic says, I sacrifice pleasure because pleasure is bad. The Nietzschean hero says, I sacrifice immediate comforts for greater joys, convenient certainties for deeper truths, and my current self for who I might become. This perspective guides us to question ruthlessly while creating joyfully, sacrificing certainty not to wallow in doubt, but to discover truths we can authentically affirm. It encourages us to embrace discomfort when it serves growth, recognizing our comfort zone is where potential dies. We learn to distinguish between values we've inherited and values we've chosen, seeing hard choices as opportunities to create meaning rather than merely discover it. We cultivate solitude without abandoning connection, understanding that creative growth requires both separation and engagement. And we transform suffering through meaning-making, knowing that when we cannot change our situation, we can still change how we respond to it. These practices show that Nietzschean sacrifice isn't about diminishment but transformation. We sacrifice not to become less, but to become more, yet we must acknowledge the dangers. Critics like Martha Nussbaum have demonstrated how Nietzsche's philosophy can justify cruelty or narcissism when misapplied. In her work The Fragility of Goodness, she argues that Nietzsche undervalues the importance of vulnerability and interdependence in human flourishing. His elevation of strength and self-sufficiency taken to extremes can foster callousness toward others. Similarly, Philippa Foot questions whether Nietzsche's master morality allows for genuine concern for others beyond mere instrumental value. These feminist critiques highlight how Nietzsche's emphasis on self-overcoming might neglect the moral significance of care and connection. The most important practical insight may be this: Nietzschean sacrifice requires ruthless honesty. We must distinguish between sacrifices that serve true growth and those that feed self-destruction or self-importance. With this discernment, we can approach the ultimate Nietzschean challenge to affirm life so completely that we would will its eternal return. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more"? Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? This thought experiment from the gay science, the eternal recurrence, brings us to the ultimate Nietzschean sacrifice, the willingness to affirm life so completely that one would choose to live it again identically for eternity. This is not just theory, but the culmination of all the sacrifices we've examined. To affirm the eternal recurrence means sacrificing the comfort of certainty for the responsibility of creating meaning, sacrificing fixed identity for the adventure of becoming, sacrificing inherited morality for authentic values, sacrificing herd security for the freedom of the heights, and sacrificing mere contentment for joy that embraces even suffering. Together, these sacrifices constitute the hero's journey in Nietzschean terms, a journey not to some distant paradise but to this life, this world, this moment, embraced with such intensity that it takes on eternal significance. The Übermensch Paradox shows that true victory requires total sacrifice because victory itself is transformed through sacrifice. Victory becomes not achieving external goals but becoming capable of affirming life without conditions. This perhaps is Nietzsche's ultimate insight. The sacrifices required for greatness aren't just means to an end but transformative in themselves. They don't just help us achieve victory, they redefine what victory means. And so we return to our opening question: why did Nietzsche believe true victory requires total sacrifice? Because victory itself is reconceived. It is not the ego's triumph over obstacles but the emergence of a self capable of affirming life in its totality, a self that can say to every moment, even the most painful, once more and once more for eternity. If you felt challenged or even disturbed by these ideas, that's precisely as it should be. Nietzsche's philosophy isn't meant to comfort but to provoke, to awaken us from the slumber of mediocrity. Perhaps you recognize aspects of your own life where you've been unwilling to sacrifice what is necessary for greatness, or perhaps you've experienced moments of transformation through sacrifice that resonate with Nietzsche's vision. Either way, I invite you to share this exploration with others who might benefit from thinking differently about sacrifice and victory. The path of the Übermensch may be lonely, but we need not walk it in complete isolation. By sharing these ideas, we create the possibility of new communities based not on comfortable illusions but on the courage to face difficult truths.